Welcome, everybody, to the Religious Studies lecture series in the Department of Classics and Religion. We are really pleased today to welcome Brett Shrew from the University of British Columbia. I'm going to start us off with the land acknowledgement, and then I will pass the floor to our colleague Tina Ruparel, who will give Dr. Shrew a formal introduction. Welcome to the University of Calgary. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So we're really pleased today to have Dr. Shrew with us for a talk titled The Fate of Our Times, Medicine, Soteriology, and Thoughts on Re-Enchanting the World. Thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Shrew.
Right on.
Great. And Tinu, would you do us the honor of formally introducing Dr. Shrew? See, he's just unmuting.
There we go. Can people hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I think I know how to do this by now. Great pleasure for me to welcome and introduce Dr. Brett Shrew to give a talk to us today. Brett and I go back a few years now, at least. We were both for a time members of the Canadian Association for Health Humanities Board. And Brett was our first secretary and part of the executive that way. And as you probably have seen in the blurb for this talk, he's had an interesting background. Thought he would just go straight into science and medicine, but got, not waylaid, but I guess,
I was going to say waylaid.
Yeah, showed that his interests in theology, in the humanities, in philosophy run very deep in that he did get his science degree and then go to medical school, but with a minor in theology. And that's not too common, I suppose. He's now a consultant pediatrician in Victoria. Holds an MA in interdisciplinary studies and is working on his PhD in the philosophy of education. He's also a Trudeau scholar, which most of you will know is a pretty big deal. It's a very difficult fellowship to get and marks really exciting scholarship. His doctoral studies are using historical and discursive approaches to investigate the grounds by which we might invert the dominance of medical expertise over things like social accountability, advocacy, and professionalism. And he wants to elaborate a concept of physicianship as medical citizen rather than purely a technician, as it were. And it situates medical expertise in service of health equality and equity to all Canadians, irrespective of social, cultural, economic, and geographic background. One of the things that I like to think about in terms of health humanities is that medicine is described often as simply the most scientific of the humanities. And that really does, I think, put religious studies and the humanities on the same level, as it were, with the scientific disciplines, and particularly with medicine. And so we're really pleased that, Brett, you could come to us today. I think you symbolize or instantiate Galen's words when he says that the best physician is also a philosopher. So with that, we'll hand it over and welcome again.
Oh, thanks, guys. Thanks for that introduction. That was lovely. I'd like to take credit for this like graffiti image of Max Weber, but I can't. That's like way better than any graffiti skill I would ever have. Yeah, and so, thanks for the land acknowledgement too, Joy. Today finds me on Vancouver Island as it usually does. I work, live, and play on the traditional territories of the Wasanich people of southern Vancouver Island. And this is land specifically governed by one of the 14 Vancouver Island or Douglas treaties. And the land I live on is specifically governed by that, to the treaty made with the South Saanich, what was called Malahat at the time, although a bit erroneously negotiated on 7 February 1852. And that's thankfully where I ply my trade. I love the island. Would have been nice to kind of hang out with you guys in Alberta, if not for COVID and biblical flooding, but there you go. Disclosure wise, just at the start, I should mention, I don't have any financial disclosures. I will say, like, disclosure wise, I assume very much everybody here is an adult. So like a few ground rules, like one, if you need more coffee, please go get it. If you need like a glass of water or whatever, just like go for it. If you need to use the washroom, go for it. If you want to interrupt, I'm not going to change your life, hopefully, with this talk. If I do, so much the better, but please feel free to do what you need to do. Just do what you need to do. This is meant to be largely informal. Before I get started, I think it's probably useful to also situate myself a little bit more. This week, I think, as we were talking before we got started, has been biblical, is probably the understatement of the year for British Columbia. Sunday night found me with my new best friend, this bucket, starting in our basement, and that leak turned into kind of a hose, more or less, for most of Monday and into Monday night. And so I think we probably bailed out over 1,000 liters of water, and thankfully we, by happenstance, invested in a Rubbermaid container. It's like 150 liters, so able to bail that out. And anyway, long story short, we got off pretty well. I think if religion comes from the word relegare in Latin, to rebind, I should say, these are moments that kind of open us up and maybe rebind us as a community in some ways. Our main road between the South Island and Up Island was washed out. This is the Malahat. Some of you have probably driven it in visits to BC. Thankfully, it's up and running again. You've probably seen images of Abbotsford, Sumas Prairie, Abagasse of Hope. Like, they're not good. The Coquihalla is destroyed. Like, it's a rough week. And yet, again, of things that sort of bind your communities together. This seems to be yet another event that is somehow bound British Columbians together, and of course, who has your back immediately? Alberta knocked on the door immediately, said, "Hey, we're here to help if you need us." As did Saskatchewan, so just awesome. Ontario did too. It's not been all gloom and doom this week. Other things that bind us together. I don't know if anybody else saw the game up in Edmonton on Tuesday night, but yeah. Sam Adegabe's dive into the snow after Kyle Laren's second goal was just amazing. And so you think of other moments that bind together communities and stories that bind us together. And where were you? This was one of them. And so maybe we'll make it to Qatar. Who knows? But it's looking pretty good. So I'm all doom and gloom this week. By the disclosure I should make, I've never talked to a Department of Religious Studies before. And so I'm kind of here on square one. I note that the ladder goes right to 38. So maybe if the talk goes well, that's where I'll end up. But full disclosure, I don't know what the genre of a religious studies talk is. I went to an anthropology conference about, during my master's. And I was like, wow, this is like really different than a med ed conference. And so, I'm going to go with like the PowerPoint talk. But if, you're like, dude, this guy has no idea how this is done, my apologies in advance. I would think of me as kind of the dumbest person in the virtual room right now. So bear with me. And hopefully we'll make it a few squares forward, not step on a snake, and go from there. Today, to give you kind of a general direction of where we're going to take things, we're going to start out by talking about other things that have caused states of emergency in British Columbia recently. This is our third state of emergency in the last 24 months, in addition to the opioid epidemic and the catastrophic flooding. Of course, we're talking about COVID-19, which has sort of dominated our lives. I want to speak a little bit about COVID, not just in BC, but in kind of Western liberal democracies today, as a sensitizing frame to how we think about the healthcare system. So I want to situate it in that context. We'll use that to kind of pivot to sort of how healthcare systems are organized as universals in civilizations, and specifically how they might be practically organized in our day and time. I'm going to then develop one of those spheres, of those three spheres that sort of construct the healthcare system. We're going to drill in a bit more to the professional sphere. That's the one I hang out most of my life. We're going to speak specifically about the discourse of biomedicine, what it does, where it came from, and how it might be repurposed. And then finally, we'll turn a little bit to Weber's work on the image of the world and in the fate of our times, to sort of talk about how biomedicine might be repurposed in a soteriological sort of fashion in the popular sphere of healthcare systems. So a lot to cover, a lot of adjectives in there. We'll see how we do. I'm hopeful we'll kind of wind up the talk portion before 3, so we've got time to chat if that works for everybody. And as I said before, like I don't have eyes on the chat box, so to speak, but if you do have a burning question, like literally interrupt me. It's all good. So COVID. Oh, COVID, if you're anything like me, you've probably spent the last 20 months or so in a daily choreography that involves things like masking everywhere you go, maintaining social distance from people. UConn really crushed it with the advertisements. They've also got the moose. They've got, I think it's 330 mosquitoes is good social distancing as well between people. So they really, I think they won the internet with this one. Obviously, this is part of the daily choreography. And then, of course, I have probably, speaking of thousands of leaders, I've probably asked myself and tons of leaders hand sanitizer since March 2020. Again, and all this messaging has been around the idea of protecting yourself from getting coronavirus, which of course SARS-CoV-2 is a novel coronavirus, and with that comes unpredictability. If we go back to March 2020, though, what I'm interested in, and what to situate this talk in highly, is actually what happened at that point in time. That's where the messaging sort of began around protecting yourself. But it also carried parallel messaging of maybe protect the healthcare system more. And so at this time, I'd suggest Western liberal democracies were providing variations on a message to their population of taking individual responsibility to protect yourself, yes, but in order to actually protect the capacity of the professional healthcare system even more. We saw messaging in places like the United Kingdom. I think this campaign actually is up for an award, the Stay Home, Protect the NHS, Save Lives campaign that was developed, highly effective, led out as a mantra, and has sort of remained the backbone of their response. We saw it, of course, here at home with appeals to flatten the curve, to let the healthcare system have a chance to catch up, so to speak, to be available to people that need it. We saw that south of the border as well, with similar sort of messaging around flattening the curve, slowing the spread. We saw it in Australia again with flattening the curve. And then, of course, we also saw it in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with calls that New Zealand's team of 5 million needs to go early, go hard, to protect Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also the healthcare system there. So similar messaging, and I'm sort of drawing on the Anglosphere here because all 5 of these countries sort of have a tradition of, the States is a little bit different, but I'm going to lump them in, of parliamentary democracy that extends from the Westminster tradition. So similar sort of governmental heritages and similar sort of social organizations from a political standpoint. This seems reasonable on first blush, and I think in some ways we could just say, why don't we just end the talk here? The need to maintain a functioning acute care apparatus in a pandemic provoked by a novel coronavirus seems like really important and straightforward. Like, why would you not want to do that? It's a time of significant social upheaval, quite a bit of uncertainty of which way this was going to go, highly infective virus, high morbidity. It would be paramount, and it is from a standpoint of effective governance and social stability, to ensure that that pillar of social order remains sturdy at a time where a lot of other things were up for grab. But I think when we look at this on second blush, these calls were made quickly and distributed widely and recurrently to protect the professional healthcare system. Like, they were almost out the minute that the COVID numbers started climbing. And they were largely followed by the majority of the population in these jurisdictions, and have continued to be so despite sort of discourses of anti-vaccination, libertarian discourses, things like that. But I think when we see patterns like this, it invites broader questions about what the actual role the professionalized healthcare system itself is playing in the organization of these societies. And so with that in mind, I want to turn to the idea of what a healthcare system might be in the first place and sort of conceptualize it in a certain way. And before I do that, I should probably say where we're at now is kind of that the maintenance of human life and the reduction of physical suffering have become paramount in contemporary Western societies. It's just sort of core cultural values now. And contemporary professional healthcare practices have emerged as powerful agents of deliverance, really, from the existential anxieties of things such as acute illness, serious sickness, finitude, and death. And I like to make the point that, it's 2021 and I'm a pediatrician. So if your 3-year-old is sick, you're probably going to take them to ACH. If it's the middle of the night, for example, and you worry they have something like an asthma exacerbation, they're having difficulty breathing. Put a plug in for ACH because we were all pretty excited when it opened back in the day because we thought, oh, cool, the Lego Hospital is coming to being, etc. If you're here in Victoria, you'll take them to Victoria General. If you're in the Lower Mainland, you'll probably take them to BC Children's. But 300 years ago, you might be taking them here, which is, again, the Cathedral de Notre Dame de Strasbourg. Now, you're probably not going to do that if you're in Alberta. That's a bit of a commute. But you get the idea. Things have shifted. 1721, you were probably going to be appealing to help from the clergy. 2021, it's unlikely you're going to go knocking on the door of your local temple, church, or mosque at this time of the morning to seek help. So things have shifted in those 300 years, and they've shifted significantly. And so with that in mind, I kind of want to put that sort of historicization there as we move into kind of how do we organize healthcare systems. And so we're going to sort of start out with the premise that healthcare is a universal. Although its forms may vary, it's kind of a defining aspect of civilization. So this is not my thesis. This is Arthur Kleinman, who's one of the medical anthropologists at Harvard. I'm going to be drawing on some of his work today, as well as that of Byron Good, who's one of his colleagues, although I think Kleinman's probably emeritus at this point. It plays a key social role, the healthcare system, and Kleinman will say, defined as organized health practices and decisive therapeutic choices. Medicine is so widespread around the globe that it's surely a universal in human organizations. So there's that social factor for sure, but it also plays a key cultural role. And I like kind of splitting up socio and cultural because they're often merged together. They do slightly different things. Kleinman will say that healthcare systems are also fundamentally cultural systems at base. They're symbolic systems, ultimately, that are built out of meanings, values, behavioral norms, and the like. And so before we go forward, I do want to kind of put a little asterisk on what I'm talking about by healthcare system here, because if you're like me, if you hear the word healthcare system or the phrase, you're probably like, oh yeah, the hospital, like Canada Health Act, this, that, the other, acute care hospitals, emergency departments, primary care clinics, and insurance and funding schemes. The way that we're going to be using healthcare system today in this part of the talk is rather a provisional system that sort of denotes 3 overlapping social arenas in which the experience of sickness is actually elaborated. And Kleinman sets these up as the popular, the professional, and the folk. And we're gonna steal like an artist here. We're gonna borrow some things from this model. We're not going to use all of it. I'm going to tell you what we'll steal from it in a few slides. I'm going to tell you why we're only borrowing some of it, but I'm going to take you through a little bit of it. So this is the model. I think Kleinman might have drawn it himself because it's relatively primitive in its drawing. I would say that probably the man is not an artist. But what you can basically see here, you have the popular sphere, which is in the middle, and it's by far the largest, and we'll talk about why that is. On the left, you have the professional sphere, which again is quite a bit smaller. The thing I want you to attend to is that there's some overlap there. And on the right, you have the folk sector. Again, quite a bit smaller, similar amounts of overlap. It's a very sort of basic schematic. But that's kind of what he was sort of envisioning when he set up this model. And when we look at each of these spheres, here's what I can tell you about them. Well, before we look at each of them, I should say, when we look at the explanatory models that happen each sphere, so each sphere, before we drill into them specifically, broadly has an operant explanatory model around the relationships of health and illness. They're going to construct clinical reality in a certain way rather than others. And so these explanatory models are going to be tied, as Kleinman will say, to specific systems of knowledge and values that are centered in the different social sectors and subsectors of a healthcare system and contain explanations of any or all 5 issues of the following. Etiology or cause, onset of symptoms, so when did things kind of start in somebody's life, pathophysiology, what has kind of gone wrong, so to speak, course of sickness, so how is this affecting somebody's life, and then treatment, what to do about it. Speaking as somebody who lives in the professional realm, and using the asthma example, for example, if somebody comes to the Victoria General with their 4-year-old at 3 in the morning and they're having breathing difficulties, they might say, okay, well, their rest rate's 40, they're saturating 88% on room air, they're expiratory wheezy, they got some inspiratory wheezing as well. Okay, probably no fever, okay, atopic history, had some eczema in the past, mom has asthma. Okay, fair enough. There's probably an asthma exacerbation. So probably, they've got some reversible airway obstruction of their small airways. It's been going on for a couple of days. So that sort of fits with the time course. That probably means that they've got some secretions in their airways that's causing the wheezing. It's clearly made them sick enough to seek out help in the middle of the night. What are we going to do? Well, we know they're beta receptors on the small airways. So we're going to give Ventolin, which will open up the airways. We know that they're, muscarinic receptors. And if we give some Atrovent, that'll open up the airways or prevent them from closing. We know that steroids are actually the thing that are going to cool off the inflammation. We'll give those. We probably need some oxygen. They're not going home, to say the least. They're going upstairs to be admitted. They might need some support. So that's how I might sort of talk through those as a professional. That sort of way of constructing knowledge and constructing an explanatory frame is different than if I found myself in the popular realm and I put myself in the parent's shoes, for example. Because the first time my kid had an asthma exacerbation and their chest looked like it was accordion, I'd be freaking out. And I'd want to know, well, this is weird. They were fine for the first few days, but now they're not fine and they're wheezy. And you know what? Actually, their lips are starting to turn blue and they're really tired. And this is not my child. The internet's not telling me what to do. No one else is really sure what to do. It's 3 a.m. What is going on here? If I were to take my kid to a naturopath, again, in this moment, there may be a different understanding of causality laid out and what to do about it. That's not to assign value to any of those per se. It's a sort of suggest that the explanations you get around a similar sort of phenomenon are going to be different on who you talk to and in what sort of model you find yourself. Does that all make sense? Yeah, right on. Okay, cool. Yeah, and again, I will say too, those roles shift. Like I have a 2.5-year-old, and so if she gets sick, like, yeah, I have a pediatrician brain, but I also see her as a parent, and so those are different sort of spaces. The binocularity is a little weird sometimes, but it's a different headspace to be in. And so I want to focus first on the popular sphere for a few reasons. One, it's by far the largest sphere in terms of healthcare interactions. And this includes healthcare interactions that are organized around individuals and their social, family, and community networks. Kleinman sort of, again, he bases a little bit on empirical studies, but I think a little bit is sort of extrapolated. He said probably about 70 to 90% of healthcare interactions in a healthcare system are going to occur in this popular sphere. And you might say, well, that seems like really high, but I'd sort of invite you to think about what happens when you get a mild headache. Do you head immediately for the nearest emergency room? Probably not. Probably like, well, I've had a lot of screens today. Or, work's been pretty stressful. Or, I missed my second coffee and maybe it's caffeine withdrawal. Or, I'm somebody who gets migraines. This one's not too bad. I can kind of do what I need to do. Or, I've had a little bit of a cold. It kind of makes sense. I might have a bit of sinus congestion, you name it. Maybe I'm not so sure, but then I turn to my spouse or I turn to my friend or I turn to my colleague at work. I'm like, hey, I got this headache. What do you think? Like, it's probably that, Or maybe if they don't know, I go to the internet and Google headache, and then I find what I want to find because that's how the internet works. And I might say, I usually do well if I stop looking at screens, so I'll turn the screen down. Or, maybe it's time to take some Tylenol or ibuprofen. Or, maybe it's time to just like stop working today and take a rest. So a lot of those healthcare interactions, which again are part of the overall healthcare system, don't go beyond that popular sphere. Most of the time, we're able to very well negotiate the onset of illness on our own, so to speak, or I should say within our networks without moving into the professional or folk sphere. Decisions about whether to actually do that, again, also occur in that occur in that popular sphere to reach out to the professional or the folk spheres. And so that's sort of where the site of action mostly happens. Now, I'm going to speak very briefly to both of the other two spheres here for 2 reasons. One, I'm going to speak to the professional in a lot more detail in a few slides. And 2, I don't want to get wrapped up in the folk sphere, and I'll explain why. But briefly, the professional sphere, not surprisingly, is the realm to which healthcare professionals, such as physicians, belong. And the folk sphere includes those who are non-professionals but are involved in activities of healing. And so the reason I don't want to spend too much time here is because it's sort of one of the limitations of this model that is, of course, already 40 years old. I'm over 40 years old, so there's still utility in being 40, don't get me wrong, but like, it's an older model, and I do recognize that, but it was sort of the first time things were modeled, and it's got some utility. The reason I don't want to get hamstrung in the professional folk differentiation is it's quite vague in the model with respect to establishing kind of a clear taxonomy of who belongs to who. You can make an argument that chiropractors may have belonged more to the folk sphere back in 1978 in the States, and they're probably more professionalized now. You could make an argument that midwifery maybe belonged more to the folk sphere at the time this model is written, but is now more professionalized. And I don't want us to get tripped up about trying to decide who belongs where, because it's just going to be confusing for the purposes of this talk and not really get to where I hope we can get ourselves. What I do want to also note is, even though there's these sort of three spheres, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that everything that happens each of these spheres is homogeneous, reproducible, and happens the same way every time. Okay, they're sort of provisional thoughts. And so, pediatrics is pretty different between Victoria and Halifax, and definitely Khalivit. Pediatrics and geriatrics are pretty different. Pediatrics and urology are totally different. They all kind of hang together on this medicine thing. They're really different. And even within my personal practice, there are things I will do with one patient that I might not do for another, or let's say do for them, but do with them, I would say. So it's a provisional sort of structuring. So it's not deterministic. It's just trying to give us a language and an approach. So the key points I kind of want us to take forward from this organization are the following. Again, I want to reiterate, the vast minority of healthcare interactions actually happen outside of that popular sphere. Professional medicine is more or less the founder of that professional sphere. And there, to me, is no question that it locates itself firmly within it. So I don't see professional medicine waltzing into the folk sphere, especially in the types of societies, what I again sort of describe contemporary Western liberal democracies, where you've got relatively well-developed acute care systems. Professional medicine very much is in that professional sphere. I want to remind you that each of these spheres constructs clinical realities that may significantly differ from one another. Now, they might align quite significantly, but they might be very different, and that's important to remember. And finally, that professional sphere in our society is highly influential, despite the fact that the vast minority of healthcare interactions happen into it. It's got a lot of symbolic power. Everybody with me so far? Yeah, cool, right on. So let's move into that professional sphere a bit more in the idea of biomedicine, or I should say the discourse of biomedicine. And so this is where I sort of turn to some more work by Byron Good, who's also a medical anthropologist. And Good will tell you that the practices of professional medicine are more or less orchestrated by a discourse of biomedicine that formulates the human body and disease in a culturally distinctive fashion. I'm making the assumption that most people are familiar with the concept of discourse. I use it sort of in a Foucauldian sense. If you're not, we got more, well, I should say before we go forward, this is a very bioscientific and reductionist orientation to health and illness. If you're not familiar with discourse, we've got more graffiti for you. So this is Foucault after he no longer had hair. And we can think about discourses as the following. This is from the Archaeology of Knowledge, so it's an earlier definition. I don't like it totally because it sort of is a bit different from the genealogy works that sort of followed later, but more or less discourses are practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. Brian Hodges, who's done some work with Foucault and MedEd, has a kind of a nice layman's definition I like a bit better. It's a little looser, but I think it's helpful. Practices, we might think of discourses as practices that make it possible to say some things but not others, to act in certain ways but not others, and to have particular roles in social worlds. And I guess what I want you to take away too is that words and practices are not just descriptive, but they're prescriptive in the social world. And that's sort of coming from Norman Fairclough's work, who's also obviously highly influential with critical discourse analysis. Again, discourses are not just representing the world, but of signifying it, constituting and constructing it in certain ways of meaning. And so that's how I kind of think about discourse in this sense when I think about a discourse of biomedicine. That's sort of a very Cole's Notes primer of two people whose work is legendary and 6 years worth of scholarship. So take it with a grain of salt. But if we think about biomedicine as a discourse from that perspective, as something that sort of constitutes the social world of professional physicians, there are a few aspects of it that I think are worth drawing out. As I mentioned, it's highly bioscientific and it's heavily reductive in how it establishes the grounds, the relationship between health, illness, and disease. Its claims to reality are based upon an extreme insistence on materialism as the grounds of knowledge. And basically that means if I can't see it or I can't touch it, it's probably not as real as other things that I can. And so it's very preoccupied with the idea you can see. And we'll sort of talk a little bit about its history, but that frame of resolution has kind of moved from organ level to molecular level to now gene level. And so the frames of resolution just keep going further and further down. It takes the individual body as its primary object of interest. So it doesn't really think in terms of population, first and foremost. It doesn't think in terms of family or community network as the site in which disease or illness is located. It's located in the individual body. And I want to focus on physical body, not embodiment, physical body. It constructs disease largely in a frame of biological pathology. The other thing it doesn't seem to like very much is ambiguity or multifactorialism. And so disordered health for a biomedical worldview is largely contingent upon a requirement that you've got sort of a single causal chain. And that single causal chain is going to specify pathogenesis in a language of structural flaws and mechanisms. And that's going to guide sort of what do you do about it. So I might see somebody in clinic, and the reason that they have muscular dystrophy is because they have a dystrophin gene on this exon, and that is the reason as to why they have their disease, and that is going to be how we tailor therapies, be those genetic, be those steroids, you name it. And so that's kind of what it does. And I'm saying it's bad or good. It is. So with that in mind, what's sort of first and foremost and privileged in this biomedical worldview is that objective, visible reality of disease is what matters the most. When you think about what's relevant and what counts, if anything's going to count in the biomedical worldview, it's this. So if you had to pick anything and you had to choose, and you only had to choose one thing, this is what it's going to choose. The subjective contours that are arguably as important and ones that powerfully shape the human experience of illness, be those psychological, social, moral, are only so many superficial ways of what Klein calls epiphenomenal cover that actually disguise this bedrock of truth. And that does not mean that no physician attends to those. I like to think we often do. But at the end of the day, they're not the things that we attend to perhaps first and foremost. And I think it probably just goes down to the fact that, if somebody comes into the emergency department and they're having an asthma exacerbation and your focus is on, what does this asthma exacerbation mean to you? Meanwhile, their oxygen saturations are dropping like a rock. The college will never forgive you, and you will be sanctioned, to say the least. Even if, it may be that people get quite a bit out of talking about what the meaning of this illness means. No one is going to leave somebody with a saturation of 50% in a 4-year-old. So that's sort of kind of the hierarchy of what matters. The other thing with biomedicine and sort of the processes and practices is it's not good at admitting other views of reality. It doesn't like ambiguity, as I mentioned, in terms of how it constructs its reality. It doesn't like alternative realities. So it's relatively inflexible towards considerations of alternative explanations of causality of sickness and those other dimensions. And I include soteriological here too, in addition to psychological, social, and moral, of that illness experience. So I think I could probably say this. I was at a pediatric conference in Charlottetown a few years ago, and somebody was giving sort of a talk on the dangers of alternative health practices. And it was like Emmanuel Goldstein and the 2 Minutes Hate in 1984. I was like, holy smokes, like they're gonna light this presentation on fire, like vitriolic anger, no sense that there could be any utility in it. And again, that's not everybody, but just I was sort of struck by it. I was like, okay, I'm going to sit by the exits and not get pitchforked here. Like, holy smokes. So it doesn't tolerate ambiguity in terms of alternative worldviews as well. And so what I want to point out, again, as I was talking about explanatory models earlier, these orientations to the relationship between health and illness here in this fashion structure the mainstream explanatory model of the professional sphere and shape the clinical realities that its practitioners, like myself, are going to produce. This is kind of how we see reality. And I want to lean into the idea of seeing reality rather than this is reality, because it's a view, it's a gaze, right? And so Good points out quite well, it's really difficult for practitioners socialized in this worldview to avoid a strong conviction that our own system of knowledge reflects the natural order, that it's a progressive system that has emerged through cumulative results of experimental efforts or empiricism, and that our own biological categories are natural and descriptive rather than thinking about them as essentially cultural and classificatory. So it's really hard to step out of the idea that this is not natural and this is actually normative. Really hard. And there's reasons for that. One of these is that a deep immersion in this worldview renders it really difficult for physicians to appreciate that their subjectivity is performatively produced by this biomedical discourse, it's not that agency is fully determined by it, but it's heavily structured. And what you kind of consider as objective and natural is actually contingent upon a belief system with a deep faith in a universal science. It's not that we don't talk about the history of biomedicine. It's not that we don't talk about alternative framings in medical education, but it's the vast minority of the time. It's often still the lectures that people don't go to, which breaks my heart, but it's kind of the case. The other thing that I find really interesting too is we have no problem assigning culture to patients and no problem recognizing that people that come to the clinic are situated in cultural frames at all. But the situated knowledge of the nature of our own knowledge and belief that informs our own professional position is essentially effaced. It just, there's no paper trail that's presented, even though if you know where to look, it's there. Which this is an effacement that kind of leads to a sense that our specific cultural orientation towards health and illness is somehow universal and value free, which of course it absolutely isn't. Janelle Taylor has spoken this eloquently. This paper is like 20 years old and it reads like it was written yesterday. These practices are bound up in what she calls a culture of no culture, the view from nowhere, so to speak. Brenda Began's doctoral dissertation, like again, 20 years ago, reads like it could have been written yesterday. This is training that produces a sense of a value neutral disposition. And from a cultural internal perspective of professional medicine, it's a practice that kind of transcends, it's a practice rather that sort of transcends the boundaries of space and time and context, you know? So this isn't something with a history. This is something that can be applied universally to whom, to where, it doesn't matter. So it's a really interesting water to be immersed into as a fish, so to speak. The interesting thing for me, though, is that this course has really been around for only over a little over 100 years, nothing more. And so I want to step into this history because I really want to sort of just demolish this idea that it's somehow natural and eternal. Ayelet Cooper, who is also on the exec with Tino and myself, had a paper that came out in 2010 that quite rightly noticed that for about the last 100 years, Western medical education is largely constructed medicine as biomedical science. We think about education as the reproduction areas of a discipline. This is basically where this worldview is being reproduced and transformed little by little over time. But this is where things are getting produced and reproduced, right? Obviously, up to this time, for centuries, if not millennia, there was definitely a different way of understanding the relationships between health and illness and sort of quote medicine. This is humoral cosmology. And that lineage sort of extends from Hippocrates in ancient Greece through Galen in Roman times, through Avicenna in the Near East and the Middle East, through Averroes, up to really through Vesalius, even in the early anatomical models, up to about 1750, give or take. And this is kind of de rigueur. And so it's sort of unshakable, which is really interesting to me that when it shook, it finally shook hard and went to pieces. And so what sort of starts happening in that 1750 to 1800 realm, sort of again in immediately post-revolutionary France, is you start getting the breakage point. This is where you sort of start getting alignments of anatomy and pathophysiology with clinical realities. This is René Léonec at Pitié-Salpêtrière in Paris with the first stethoscope. You can see it in his left hand. It's actually basically just like a paper towel tube. But this is where things sort of start. And this, of course, we know this is kind of Foucault's thesis in The Birth of the Clinic. And it's worth reading. It leaves out some history there, but it's pretty good. You get some good linkages of causality of illness, again, to disease in the material body. Again, we're not talking about people at this point in time being possessed anymore. We're not talking about really different models of what's going on in a body when opened up. We're talking about sort of like, your liver looks terrible. And before you died and we looked at your liver looks terrible, you looked jaundiced and you looked like you had like your hands were flapping and you were sort of out of it. What's going on there? French academic medicine from that kind of point forward starts beginning to link findings in the clinic to findings in the lab and the dissection room. So there starts being a link between the clinic room and the laboratory. As Germany consolidates sort of post-Napoleonic phase and then in through the 1860s and into the first stages of the empire, you have, or the second empire, I should say, you have well-funded German universities and hospitals further developing medical sciences throughout kind of the 19th century. And this kind of ends up transforming medical education in part because at the time, going to Germany from North America was like a big deal. because that's where sort of, quote, the big stuff was going on. And so the influences of medical science is coming largely out of Germany, be it Heidelberg, for example, in this time period is being soaked up by a lot of North American medical elites who are going, quote, to the old continent to find out what's going on in the old world, and to check out this sort of new empirical approach to disease causation and how to link it to the lab. They come back like evangelicals, to be perfectly honest with you. This is a vision of a laboratory-based, all-conquering science that could sweep away all doubts before it. So this is kind of a new power. In this power and this philosophy and this way of seeing gain significant traction in North America, mostly in the United States, somewhat in Canada. To be honest with you, most of our influence comes by way of the States rather than by directly through, in kind of the 1880s, 1890s, first decade of the 1900s. And this culminates, as some of you may have heard, you may not have, in what's called the Flexner Report. Biomedicine being a historicized form and a powerful worldview, of course, comes with its own mythology and creation myth, and the Flexner Report is its creation myth. If you're cultural internal in medical education and you're not a critical scholar, you probably still think of the Flexner Report as the thing that changed it all. Non-physician writes a report, talks about the poor conditions found in most medical schools in North America, and out of that comes the new era of modern biomedicine that makes everything better. That's basically the Coles Notes version that still gets talked about. If you drill into it quite a bit more, there's a series of social and political shifts that enable this report to be infused with a tremendous amount of symbolic power. And although I would argue that its abilities in and of itself to, quote, transform things have been massively overstated, what it does do is it's sort of keystone and series of shifts that reconsolidates medical education in the medical field and puts it on the footing we see now. So this is a symbolically powerful text. We can talk about why if you want to afterwards. It sort of consolidates and legitimates a medical education that's underpinned by empiric biomedical sciences. Not only does it do that, it sort of cuts off everybody else. So there were 150 schools in North America at that time. Flexner said they should be dropped to 31. Got down to about 70. Canada, we didn't lose any per se, but Dalhousie got its teeth kicked in and was forced to kind of do quite a bit of things. There's errors in this report. He basically said that Université de Montréal and Université Laval were the same place, which is, just awesome and kind of insulting, but there you go. This sort of report and its effects, again, extend subsequently to the practice of clinical medicine as people sort of are trained. And basically, the recommendations sort of, not surprisingly, still read kind of fresh and contemporary today. A medical school becomes properly a university department. That is still not entirely the case in the States. Every medical school is linked to a university in Canada. He lionizes the Johns Hopkins model, and probably for good reason. His brother was a pathologist that worked there, so he had a lot of exposure to it. He also had all the grades that the American Medical Association did 5 years earlier, and basically just reproduced all of those in his report. So, whatever. Anyway, start ranting at the guy. Basically, this model was a university-based medical school to train students to think like scientists, furnishing 2 years of basic science instruction and 2 years of supervised clinical experience by university-based physicians in a teaching hospital. This is still kind of the backbone of what we do. There's variations on the theme, and I'd say it's starting to change. But this is it's a creation myth for a good reason. It consolidates and lays down sort of what counts for truth in the modern biomedical period. This influence actually goes back across the Atlantic and is highly influential actually in England and in Germany as well, believe it or not, in a subsequent report. General themes, again, perhaps not surprisingly, include things like medical positivism, the scientific method, and learning by doing, which again, all sort of are still very much at home in medical education in 2021. I mention all this because I sort of want to point out that biomedicine has its own origin story, has a powerful creation myth as its origin story, is a very powerful form, comes with affordances and limitations, and it's sort of based in its own history and based in its own time. So what sort of informs the professional sphere, as influential as it is still based on a historical form. So there's affordances that come with that, and there's limitations, obviously. And with that in mind, I sort of want to turn this, again, playing with some ideas of Weber around the image of the world and the fate of our times, and specifically why I think that biomedicine actually has migrated into the popular sphere to some degree and is actually being enacted in somewhat certain ways than what is being used in the professional sphere. So I told you earlier, or suggested earlier, told, that sounds very imperative, that the healthcare is kind of a defining aspect of civilizations. But Weber will argue that the organization of civilizations is also infused with the central aspect of salvation and redemption. These aspects of salvation and redemption are organized around a specific, systematic, and rationalized image of the world. And as he says quite eloquently, from what and for what one wished to be redeemed, and let us not forget could be redeemed, depended on one's image of the world. Now, this is St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, and there's some lovely paintings from kind of the mid 16th century, around the time of the siege, the first siege, and then around the second siege, where you just like look at Vienna and like St. Stephen's is just like massively towering over everything. It's like this tiny little village and then this like enormous cathedral. You see this sort of pattern reproduced in Gothic cathedrals across Western Europe, again, which obviously predate the 15th and 16th centuries. But what I would suggest, and again, this is where I think you guys may be tearing your hair out because you're like, this guy doesn't know a stick about religious studies scholarship. So bear with me because this, I think, is going to get a little tacked on. But I would suggest that the image of redemption in Western societies was embodied for centuries up to the Reformation by Roman Catholic religious practices, guided powerfully by metaphysics, informed by mysticism, and defended by scholasticism. And so what I want you to take away from that, even if I've done a total hatchet job on things, is that the focus in the image of the world is salvation for the next one. This is a world or a view that sort of thinks about the life to come. It's not one that necessarily thinks about the importance of the here and now, because that's not the focus. So what one is being redeemed from is this earthly realm to be reunited in heaven with, again, Jesus, a Christian God, you name it. And I'm leaning into Christianity specifically because of its pretty important role in the organization of societies post-Roman Empire. And obviously, as the Romans had Christianity as their state religion for the last kind of, 180 years, 160 years of the West, obviously different in the East, but I don't want to say Christianity and Catholicism was the only driver, but it's important, especially with Charlemagne, et cetera, and therefore what followed. But so the focus is kind of on what is to come, not on what is now. This changes a little bit with the Reformation. And so Weber points out that for the first time in Luther's writings comes this idea of the calling or a vocation. And he suggests that this sort of augurs a shift away from the world to come and the world beyond and salvation for the world beyond towards the pursuits of this world and material actions here in the now. So the focus of what sort of matters most has gone from salvation from this world in preparation for the next, to salvation in this world is a kind of the highest thing you can do for favor towards God. For Luther, where he kind of gets to, according to Weber, is the fulfillment of worldly duties under all circumstances is the only way to live acceptably to God. It and it alone is the will of God. And so Weber sort of says Luther gets to this point, and it's not that he doesn't take it forward to any great degree, but it's really Calvin, I should say, not just Calvin, but Calvinism and then Puritan groups that followed Calvinism, be those in the Netherlands, be those in England, be those in what became New England in the United States, that kind of turbocharged this stance. And so they sort of take this idea that the highest form of moral obligation of the individual is to fulfill his duty in worldly affairs. It became obligatory to regard oneself as chosen, and the lack of certainty being indicative of insufficient faith. So in a doctrine of double predestination, if you're going to look like you're going to heaven, if you're going to heaven, you should act like you're going to heaven. If you're not going to heaven, only people that are like not going to heaven are going to act like in a bad way. So you should probably act like you're going, because otherwise, like, what's that going to look like, right? So the performance of good works in worldly activity became accepted as the medium whereby such surety could be demonstrated. And so hence success in a calling eventually came to be regarded as a sign, never a means of being one of the elect. And so what Weber does with this, he doesn't go so far, and again, I suspect everybody in this room knows a crap ton more about Max Weber's work than I do on this topic for sure. But what my reading of it is to say, it's not as though Calvinism or Puritan sort of derivatives of Calvinism were of the mindset that like you make money for the sake of money, or you work for the sake of work per se, but it sort of suggests that it lays the conditions for people to sort of look at worldly work as the sine qua non of what counts for what matters, because it sort of proves that you're one of the elect. And then what Weber does, and I think it's quite clever, is he actually suggests that the focus on the worldly and the sake of accumulation of capital for the sake of itself, or an end of itself, actually becomes untethered from the conditions of their production and get reinscribed as an ethos of modern capitalism. And I think this is important because he makes the point quite rightly that like Luther really didn't have any time for like, well, Lutheranism and early Protestantism really didn't have any time for large, sort of institutions that were going to be making money, et cetera. Calvinism certainly didn't have any time for that, but sort of the offshoots of that ethos get reinscribed as a practice that leads to kind of modern capitalism. And this idea, not just to make enough to kind of keep yourself happy and comfortable, but to make and produce for the sake of making and producing on a material sort of level. So the material becomes paramount. And so we've sort of shifted from focus beyond to a focus to this world to a focus only on this world. And so this becomes a pursuit of the material, a focus on the world as it is, and not to one beyond. And so when we look at this sort of accompanies definitive shifts towards the secular, the modern, and scientific rationality, and sort of what I would call the popular sphere. Now, again, this is going to differentially be taken up in different stratas of societies. This sort of maybe locates itself in sort of a bourgeois plane, so to speak. But this sort of ethos is going to trickle down. And in a meritocratic, I put air quotes around it, but in a society that believes in meritocracy like the United States, for example, that sort of class conscious, the borders around the class consciousness is going to change a bit, right? So you're going to get permeation of ethos in a way you might not get otherwise. And so Weber's lovely overquoted, but still pretty useful comment that the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, above all by the disenchantment of the world, is this idea that no longer in this era are we appealing necessarily to things beyond. Things can be studied, things can be known. Even if you can't know everything, there's a way to materially kind of measure it and go after it. And so these sort of aspects, again, are they exactly step in step with the development of biomedicine? That remains to be seen, but they're parallel sort of developments in their own way. And I think for the purposes of our talk today, what I want to point out is they start to lay fertile ground for a popular realm that can take up a materialist notion of what health, illness, and disease should look like. And so when we think about the image then of the world as an image of a biomedical world, I would suggest that the effects of a biomedical discourse are not limited to the professional sphere, even if it originated there. Rather, they probably are finding fertile ground in a popular sphere that is now and has been for decades driven by concerns of the secular, the material, and the rational. I'm not saying that there's no more spiritual whatever. There, of course there is. But again, compared to like a society organized around, say, 1720, the game has changed, and the game's changed powerfully. Kleiman sort of spoke about this in that paper from 1978, actually, and I think he was sort of foreshadowing some correct movements. The influence of the professional realm in biomedicine may now be significantly shaping the healthcare beliefs and expectations of the popular sector, so that lay people are now also operating with a more mechanistic and less psychosocial model of clinical reality, and accordingly are probably more interested in technical information and interventions, and less interested in socially meaningful explanations and psychosocial interventions. Again, that's not to say it's the only explanation, but it sort of gives us some sense as why biomedicine and sort of biomedical interpretation in the professional realm continue to maintain, if not increase, in their power. When we go back to the sort of encounters between spheres, and I want to point this out because we sort of talked about at the beginning that these spheres overlap, two things are worth noting. One, the clinical encounter between somebody from the popular realm and the professional realm is actually happening. That is to say, amongst all choices, a person has elected to consult with a professional physician, who's often a stranger they've never met before, proceed with all the vulnerability that a move like that entails in order to make sense out of their discomfort or their child's, or what Svennius has described as the unhomelike aspect of illness. It never ceases to amaze me that it's 3 a.m. and I'm on call and somebody brings their child in to see me. And I know I have like a socially legitimated role, but it's fascinating because when you're sort of bereft of options and it's a concern about how your body is working, you're probably going to the hospital in 2021 to get that looked at. So the clinical encounter is actually happening. And I think for me, that alone is important. 2, the clinical realities at this point in time may actually be having significant overlap, for which the act of diagnosis, while it foregrounds different activities for each party, is actually doing two things. Again, people are coming to us for a diagnosis. And I think that's interesting because diagnosis in Greek, of course, if you break it down, means coming to know something as apart or distinct. On my side, that's going to put a biomedical identity onto a person. And I talked a little bit about explanatory models earlier. It's going to structure that patient role in certain ways rather than others. And it's going to tell me what I should do, ideally, to probably get somebody better. So it's going to organize therapeutic activities and management strategies. So diagnosis, again, which is a biomedical artifact, I would argue, and probably, again, the thing that matters most within the professional realm, because it's an act of naming that lets us do things, is being taken up probably differently in the patient realm. It still reverberates powerfully, or the popular realm. But I'll tell you that diagnosis is also a way of making meaning out of the chaos of suffering and warding off the displacement the onset and continuation of illness can augur for individuals in that fragmentary and unhome-like position that illness brings. And so Byron Good speaks to it more eloquently than I ever could. He sort of recognizes that diagnosis and therapeutic activities can be understood as efforts to counter the unmaking of the life world. It's an effort to depict the source of disease, to localize and objectify cause. One of the central efforts in healing is to symbolize the source of suffering, which means to find an image around which narrative can take shape. To name that origin is to seize power to alleviate it. And it's also a critical step in the remaking of the world and an authoring of an integrated self that's been interrupted by the onset of acute illness that you may not know the origins of. So this is sort of, again, the image of the world, so to speak, that one may be delivered from, so to speak. It's a bit of a leap, but I think it works. To a population, again, whose understandings of healthcare have been heavily influenced by the circulation of the discourse of biomedicine into the public sphere, I would argue it's these less appreciated activities and effects of biomedical interpretation that probably are recasting the drivers of this disenchantment of the world actually in a powerful way, as powerful meaning-making aspects around which healthcare's ascendances and important cultural values actually been orchestrated. So paradoxically, the scientific explanation may actually be carrying with it significant sort of benefit because it also provides a name. And I think naming is a tremendously important act. So with that diagnosis, and may also co-travel with some psychological, social, and moral effects to patients. And I would say that if one's image of the world is that of the material world, medicine is deeply implicated in our contemporary image of what constitutes the suffering from which we and others hope to be delivered in our culture's vision of the means of redemption. That's sort of Good's thoughts, not mine, but I agree with them. This set of relationships, arguably, that sort of produces this reality is kind of the contemporary lifeblood of the symbolic power with which professional medicine continues to run within our society, and by extension, the professional healthcare system. And so I think now we maybe have some better sense as to why calls to protect it have been made and why calls to protect it were taken up so readily. These aren't just utilitarian. I would argue they're bound up in larger frames of salvation, which again, I think may be a little bit of a stretch. I'd love to pick your brains on it, but that's kind of how things sort of feel. So we're running out of time. It's about 3. Last 2 slides, implications for care and education. I think drawing explicit attention to this key aspect in both care and education highlights the tremendous stakes that are actually involved in a clinical encounter in terms of hope, in terms of vulnerability, in terms of need for explanation. Biomedicine is not just sort of a descriptive practice, it's a hermeneutic practice, right? Like it's fundamentally relational, it's fundamentally interpretive. It has to be. Like I always make the joke, but it's true. I don't exist without patients. I have no reality as a professional if I don't have patients. I don't exist. So it's interpretive and relational that way. And if we kind of attend to this aspect and recognize this is what diagnosis is probably doing in the popular realm and with lay society, this gives us some good space to think about how do we render clinical care more hospitable? Because if people are coming to us bereft and feeling out of options and looking for meaning to restructure their world and be delivered from the uncertainties of sickness, this becomes all the more important that they feel welcome or that they feel less unwelcome. This gives us opportunities to identify the affordances of what the cultural construction of the body, principally material frames in clinical care, can do for us, because it can do many things. Like I'm not trying to say it's all bad whatsoever. If I thought it was all bad, I wouldn't be a pediatrician. Be doing something else. But also it gives us some space to not blind us to the person embodied through this body is the ultimate focus of that care and those moral, psychological, social, and I would argue soteriological aspects that co-travel with it. So hopefully I've made it to square 2 here today. I'm not so sure. Maybe I'll go up to 17 and fall back to 7 or so, but hopefully there's something useful in there for everybody. that's my email address if you want to shoot me one. And I'm done. So thank you for like staying awake and also for being here on like a Friday afternoon. So right on. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Brett. That wow, there's so many threads to pull on and to think about there. I know I have some thoughts and questions, but I want to open the floor first to see if other people have questions, thoughts, or comments that they would like to share or ask. Tinu.
Yeah, gosh, thanks, Brett. That's you've given us all, I'm sure, a huge amount to think about. And there were, many fireworks going off in my brain as you're going through this. One of the things I wondered if you could do while you've got your slides up is if you could go back to that slide with the little hand-drawn sort of model image of the three spheres that what's his name provides.
Oh yeah. Let me
Yeah.
see if I can. I'll tell you what, Tina. I'm gonna actually jump out of this quickly.
Okay.
And go back
There we
because
go.
like
Thank you.
click this thing for like until the end of time. There we go.
As soon as I looked at that, I thought this looks incredibly like many sort of models of religion that have happened or have developed across religious studies over the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years or something like that. The idea, for instance, in the middle that there's beliefs, decisions and choices, relationships, interactions, institutions, all of those kinds of things. I mean, you can go to, gosh, I can't think of his name right now. I can only think of the way I do it myself. But the various, sort of categories and dimensions, Ninian Smart dimensions of religion that he basically picks up most of these kinds of things. And it's interesting to me that the professional and the folk sector are on these boundary lines, which gets me back to the last kind of point you made about how the professional sphere is starting to move in some ways to the popular sphere, whereas and tell me if I'm wrong, I think you're saying the popular sphere is taking on some of those activities, those kinds of paradigms and models that were properly in the professional sphere. And again, this reminds me of the whole movement of spiritual, not religious, and non-metaphysical religion and things like that. Finally, the question I guess I'm wondering about, because you left us with a question about how the professional sector, the biomedical sector, could become better able to engage with human beings in a broader way, a less reductionistic way. And the stuff that's going on in kind of the so-called secular realm seems to me not so much a kind of contrast to religion proper, but rather a kind of pletherization, a pluralization, what people sometimes call a fecundization. Basically, in that secular sphere or in that popular sphere, you're getting more and more options for religion, for spirituality, for all of those kinds of things. And so I wonder whether that kind of popularization, that kind of pluralization is starting to, can it make headway into the professional sector when, for instance, you may not want to go all the way to the folk sector and get, whatever it is, Reiki or something like that. But those kinds of alternatives and the pletherization, the kind of, pluralization of perspectives that you see in the center, is that a way that could be used to mitigate the kind of reductionism that you see in the professional?
A great question. So first blush, yeah, I think so. And I think in part, probably one way to go about it, again, and I spend my life thinking about education practices, so that's sort of where my mind initially goes. I've been always like super interested that there's no sort of, it's not that there's not anything, but the very little amount of curricular, formal, informal, you name it, involvement that goes on thinking about the situated nature of biomedical practice. It's not necessarily to say it's a tool, but I was like, if I was learning to be a welder, I'm pretty sure I would get some teaching on how to use it safely. People wouldn't just hand me like a torch and be like, yeah, get out there and go weld some stuff. I'd probably burn my arm off. But this sort of lack of situatedness that comes, because it does, there's not really any sort of grounding of it. It's sort of often, almost not entirely, but it's taught a lot as sort of an unopposable good. This is something that will help people, and I don't disagree with that. There's tremendous utility in it. There's relatively less that talks about the wounding and the unintentional effects that can come with the effects of this worldview and how it's deployed. And the other thing that I think that probably needs to be looked at and thought out and probably theorized a bit better, honestly, is how do you take a worldview that is relatively intolerant of ambiguity and reinscribe it such that it's a bit more tolerant of other ways to think and establish relationships between health and illness? And I think, it's less about, this is where I get a little bit sort of miffy or kind of like distrustful of the idea that, discourse rules the roost, because discourses in some ways, they can be repurposed, obviously. They don't have the final role in agency. It's often the ways in which they're deployed and how they create and construct practice and what those practices reproduce that sort of cause them to be either hegemonic or not. And so I would say, there are very much ways of putting a biomedical discourse and its associated practices to use in ways that can be both more open and hospitable. And that probably means on the education side, getting a better sense from the get-go in medical training that these are situated knowledges with affordances and limitations very much. There are, again, there's other ways of thinking about the relationships between health and illness. There's probably utility in educating people to recognize that one act may have myriad effects. Like for me, again, like I was talking about, diagnosis does one thing. It sort of structures the hospital experience. Diagnosis for other people, and again, I was using acute care as sort of the focus today, and acute care makes this an easier model than chronic illness for sure. And I'm a pediatrician again too, so it's not that we don't see kids with chronic illness, but we see relatively less compared to the adult sphere. So keep that in mind. But there are certainly ways to align this, I think, with frames and ethos of hospitality, for example, that makes those spaces of healthcare and uncertainty more welcoming. But I think in order to do that, honestly, Canada, or I should say Canadian professional medicine, has been sort of described as the last bastion of unregulated autonomy. Like there's no real government oversight, right? And I'm kind of at the point, honestly, like physicians know a lot of stuff. They don't know everything. They're really good at talking about like they know everything. Like some guy probably will show up to your religious studies seminar and start talking about Max Weber like he knows what he's talking about, right? But all kidding aside, there's the other thing that's interesting, I think, and I'm not sure if it comes with training or what, but the sense that you can speak to anything because you're a physician probably needs to go away. And I think with that comes sort of a recognition that you kind of probably have to surrender some sense of nebulous autonomy for the greater good. And while that may come with maybe a little bit of loss of income or privileges or whatever, that may also come with the gain of time and bandwidth, so you're not having to like see somebody in 5 minutes and then say like, oh, I'm sorry, you got to go. That's all the time you get. You can see them for 30 minutes, which sounds like not even that much, but it's 6 times as much time. It might actually provide the grounds by which people actually feel like, oh yeah, heard. And you also get the grounds as a practitioner to sort of catch your breath and be like, okay, am I like meeting what this person's asking for here? I don't know if that answers. It's rambling as always, but maybe that sort of gets somewhere.
I'll just make one more comment and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Musek, who I hope might actually pick up on this little comment as well. There's all the sort of stuff that med students are taught and physicians, all that educational side of things, but then the formation of the physician is left in some ways, in my experience, to be kind of not quite just, left to the wind, as it were, but it's just left kind of to osmotically happen. And the more I've spent time in health humanities, the more I think that actually the way med students are taught is really very similar to monasticism. And I wonder whether actually a more conscious revision or redescription of a medical student as a monk or a nun might actually, without changing too much of the curriculum, might actually change the person a little bit more differently in their way of thinking about all of these things. But anyway, I'll pass it on. Thanks.
Oh, totally. And there's, I pick up on that idea of formation wholly, because again, the emphasis on doing, so to speak, is paramount in medicine. Being and becoming are relatively less appreciated gerunds and participles, I think is safe to say.
Carolyn, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Brett, for a wonderful talk. You said at the outset that you weren't quite sure if this was fitting into the genre of religious studies talks, but I think it fit perfectly into it because it's just so multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and it just made me think of so many things. I'm a medievalist. I focus on medieval Christianity, and I found your talk very helpful for showing a difference in approach to as you're looking at the soteriology. The tendency in our age to focus on the diagnostic, the unambiguous, the clear, and that there's this whole other world. We could look to the pre-modern world for this understanding of a maybe ritualistic meaning that is ambiguous, but has meaning nonetheless, and does talk to issues of redemption and salvation. So I found that really helpful. I'm so glad this is recorded because I will point my students to this. But yes, I guess getting back to Dr. Riparel's point about, it seems that the ideal, or maybe you were hinting at trying to reintroduce a re-enchantment into the medical profession. And so, this notion of it lacks a mysticism, where we have that in the early, you were showing that mysticism served as this purpose and scholasticism helped support that. So yes, I was wondering if you thought about if this is something that you are suggesting, and what would be the mysticism that you would hope for? Maybe it's something more vocational, the training of the formation that was just alluded to, but if you've thought about that, of the re-enchantment of the medical profession.
Oh yeah, no. I think I'm amazed by the number of people when they start medicine that are in there to help people. Like it's sort of like a really nice reminder that there's some good humanity out there, which I'm actually an optimist by nature. I feel like I'm conditionalizing my sentences more and more these days. Like that. It's such a nice reminder, and just like in a good number of like first year medical students, just like the intellectual curiosity, and not just in the idea, but in the person, like in this idea of knowing somebody's situation, of trying to make somebody's situation better. And sort of, I think what first year medical students are actually way better at doing than sort of finishing medical students or early residents is actually like walking in the shoes of patients, because they're often closer to that sort of subject position than they are that of a physician at that point in time. So, they can find grounds for conversation about things that actually matter quite a bit that a later medical student might not, because that later medical student is arguably bound up in trying to figure out grammar and in healthcare relationships, and has some, I'm not a cognitivist, but probably has some of their bandwidth taken up by that. So that's one thing. There's sort of been an ongoing and unanswerable debate in medical education. How do you prevent the decline of empathy through medical training? Like, does it decline? And if so, why doesn't it come back? And I think the framing of the question is maybe not. I think one of the reasons we're kind of stuck in it is maybe that it needs to be framed and thought through better, honestly, rather than sort of just, it disappears, then it sort of comes back, but not as much. The other thing that I think, especially with COVID, that when you think about re-enchanting, for example, and what that might look like, I have to say I'm distressed by the amount of continuous and ongoing pressure that's been put on healthcare workers. I have gotten off really easily. This is the one pandemic in history that I know about where children have not been preferentially affected, which is astonishing to me. Like we sort of were just like, oh God, and we've been really quite fine. But my adult colleagues have been drinking from the fire hose for months now, years, without any break. And it's not just, I think about the physicians naturally because I am one, but nursing colleagues are just like, I mean, my world is bereft without nurses, and they're getting destroyed, and nobody went into medicine or a healing profession, and I think we can call them healing professions, with the idea that they were going hopefully to be burned down to the ground, in the process of healing. And so, I think that it can't be a zero-sum game where the act of providing space for one person to heal should ultimately take away from the person who's helped to create the space to heal, so to speak. But I'm distressed by, I don't want to pick on health authorities. I don't want to pick on provincial governments. I don't want to pick on federal governments per se, but I think sometimes there are priorities that come with bureaucratic organizations whose bottom lines and sort of what matters most may be different than the people involved in those systems. And I get that, if I was managing Island Health or Northern Health, I'd be like, oh yeah, we can't go broke. That's good. We got to keep that going. And it's like such a big thing that, oh yeah, just like have those people work a bit more. We'll pay them a bit more or something, give them extra overtime. Whereas at a certain point, like if your system is run by and for humans, that sort of technocratic logic can't hold, right? Like we're not cogs, and the ability of people to sort of be hospitable is highly contingent on that system being hospitable towards them in the first place, So that sort of re-enchantment for me sort of actually locates itself maybe in joy actually of work, the ability to actually recognize that I've connected with this person in a way that's sort of transforming their life. And it doesn't have to be sort of, violins in the background and sort of these great moments of transformation. But, there are small, like clinical medicine's made up of a lot of the small, like the extra thank you that you don't expect. You don't expect to be thanked because it's your job, but, that you see somebody like 2 years later, you picked up like their congenital heart lesion, you're like, oh man, you're totally fine. Like, it's great, those to me are sort of the, I'd almost call them secular re-enchantments. And, I'd say too, that with the onset of things like artificial intelligence, it's sort of what is actually a human? What's the location of a human? How is being human embodied per se? These are questions that I don't think we're being asked, and I'm certainly not asking because it's not my field per se, but that are coming up in, I'd say, in the medical education world, that weren't there 10 years ago. And I worry that in the drive to disrupt, in the drive to kind of automate, in the drive to rely on big data, the human experience or what you're building some of these systems for is probably getting lost in the weeds a bit. So yeah, there's a lot there, and I don't know if I've answered a really good question, but just some, I tend to talk in tangents, so hopefully like those are like 6 useful
That's
tangents.
really helpful. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Totally, thank you.
I have a question that I think maybe builds on Dr. Musik's question about enchantment and disenchantment. I was really struck by your description of the individual and diagnosis being located in the individual, the move sort of at the end of the 18th century to mechanize the understanding of kind of how the individual body works. And then you also talked very briefly at the beginning about healthcare systems as a universal. So I think, I don't know if I'm going to be able to formulate my question perfectly, but I'm curious about maybe how you see an understanding of the individual shifting in biomedical discourse. And this question partly comes out of my own research background. I study the 17th century, and in a class I'm teaching on religious experience, a student was asking me how spiritual experience has changed over time, and I was reflecting on how interesting it is that in the documents from the century I look at, when people are, sometimes they have to write these spiritual journals, and in those spiritual journals, the kinds of things that they're writing about themselves would seem very public to us now. The understanding of the self has changed and had a more public structure, I think, in the period I study. And now, the individual as the locus of diagnosis atomizes our understanding of the self, I think. But then COVID, it seems like, has put pressure on that, maybe even more so in the United States, where there's been this bigger debate about masking and vaccination. It seems like some people are not so interested in protecting the healthcare system. So that tension, this isn't a well-formed question, but I'm interested in that tension between the individual as a sort of atomized, distinct locus of mechanical problems that then lead to illness, and then the universal healthcare system, which is something bigger. Reflections on the relationship between those two poles of the ideas of health and illness. Yeah,
no, for sure. I think I'll try to give like a really like confusing answer back.
Perfect. Thank you.
No, Joy. The thing that comes to my mind, like especially that sort of representation of self in that time period versus now, like it makes me think about social media and how there are aspects of things that people like wouldn't have talked about publicly 10 years ago that now like show up on their Twitter feed or on their Facebook page or on Instagram or Snapchat, you name it. And it's like, wow, this is like put out for public consumption, but it's often a curated sort of public consumption. So there's sort of like, again, I'm not sort of I probably belong to the 16th century in terms of my technological abilities, maybe the 17th, maybe I'm not that techie, but I've been really struck how there's sort of been a split between like the presentation of self in kind of everyday life on a social media level. So that sort of face, so to speak, versus like the face that one presents in one's regular life that isn't sort of taken up through, technologies like Twitter or whatever. The gulf sometimes between what's presented and what's kind of going on behind the scenes, because often like it's really striking the number of people that either like I'm getting off of social media despite having millions of followers because I can't take it anymore, or actually I look really happy on social media but have been suffering from major depression for years. So that's sort of, those questions about representation and public consumption of self, I think have changed. And maybe that's because how we think of what's publicly consumable in terms of who we are has changed. I think I would say, and again, this is where I feel like I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, when we think about sort of how societies are organized in terms of collective versus individualistic impulses. I think, to try to give an example of that, I think maybe will come out in the wash in terms of masking. Like, I'm a dual citizen. I grew up in the States. I am a child of the Canadian healthcare system in terms of professions. My parents were in a really bad accident. They live in the States. Well, my dad does. My mom died in we were married for like 4 months, like 2018. My parents were in a really bad automobile accident. And like my dad was in like an ICU. My mom was more or less fine. She like died like a month later of an unexpected pulmonary embolism. And I mention all these things because I found it really interesting how the healthcare system there was structured, because like, they had like good insurance because it's all private there. And so, they didn't have necessarily their savings exhausted by this, but like these bills would show up and you're like, my God, like what? And yet, like, there seemed to be no problem with it. And sort of, there's sort of buried in the background of this, there seemed to be no problem about this, so per se, from like the perspective of my brother. I was like, how do you not think this is insane? He's in the States. But it sort of got me thinking, like the way that the society is sort of set up is, the importance of individual autonomy, the ability to kind of choose your private insurance or the ability to kind of like choose your hospital seems to outstrip healthcare as a social right, so the preservation of autonomy from oversight seems to be more important to them as a cultural value. Again, there's heterogeneity around that because it's not static, but basically I sort of came up with the sense that government is something there you kind of protect yourself from, it's there to be limited. Whereas here at home, like, government is more or less seen as a way to afford further and better expression of social rights, for example. So there's a little bit, it's not that we're not individualists as Canadians. We are to some significant degree. And I would say that probably varies again by urban versus rural, province by province, you name it. But there, I'd say, is more of a collective aspect that probably again comes a little bit more from sort of founding traditions, one, but also the way things kind of went historically, right? Like we have a publicly funded, publicly delivered healthcare system, more or less. It's not perfect and it's not complete. There are holes all over it. But we're already in a position where there's sort of a, government in sort of collective action is seen as a way to afford individual freedom. Whereas I think in the States, it's seen as something to be protected from in order to protect individual freedom. So, it's one example, but I think then, the question or the debate around whether or not one should wear a mask on one side of the 49th is like, man, I should probably do that because it's kind of at the baseline of how we sort of think about the role of government, the role of collective action. Whereas the other side, it's like, well, it's my choice. And like, like I should decide. And it's like, okay, that's like, and again, like, you're kind of like, that seems kind of crazy because, but I guess to the Americans, maybe it doesn't, or maybe to some of them it doesn't. But I think, ultimately too, when you come back to biomedicine locating itself in the individual body, it struggles a little bit in the face of sort of larger social phenomena. So it struggles a little bit in things like a pandemic, whereas public health can speak a lot more strongly to it. And I would say that, again, we probably would benefit from a more robust public health tradition in Canada. We have a pretty good one. I'd say the boundaries between it and professional medicine are stronger than they should be, certainly in times like this. Whereas in the States, it's really not very well developed at all, at least in terms of, I mean, they have one, don't get me wrong, but I'd say its force is less so. So, for us, like in BC, like, Bonnie Henry, like people are like, yeah, I'm going to listen to Bonnie because like Bonnie is the chief health officer, like provincial health officer. She's got a lot of good stuff to say, you name it. Same thing with Dina, I'm sure, in like Alberta, you name it, like Hinshaw. And like in the States, like, like the public health officers were like sometimes getting listened to, but sometimes like verbally threatened. And you're like, this is nuts. So, I think that when we again think about, and one thing I did speak to at all, because I'm not a public health physician, is what the role of public health tropes and sort of discourses look like in the delivery of a healthcare system. And I think that's where pushing things beyond sort of just biomedicine are actually really useful to think about in times like this. And I think they will be, I'm hopeful they will be going forward. It's last thing I'll say is like, it's astonishing to me how awesome public health is when you have a baby and you're like, I didn't know you guys could do all this. They're like, yeah, what do you think we do? I'm like, why didn't I hear about this in like 15 years of medical training? Like we're nothing, but they're amazing. And I'm also just kind of like floored sometimes why we don't invest more in public health, because it would just like take so much pressure off the acute care system. For like, I mean, there's no argument not to, like the cost benefit ratio is off the chain amazing. Yeah, that's like a long answer in a lot, but I don't know if that means anything or not.
Thank you for that answer and for that interesting, reflection on the self and the individual in healthcare. And I think we have time for probably one more short question. Does anybody have one last closing question they'd like to ask? I have another question, but it's not a short one. So I'll throw it into the air, but we probably don't have time to discuss it thoroughly because I'm really interested in, oh good, Kelly, I'm gonna let Kelly take it because my question's not a short one. Kelly, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure. Just thank you so much, first of all, for the talk. It's so fascinating and kind of right up my alley. I guess one of the, in your presentation, you didn't really want to open the can of worms on the folk sector, which I can understand, but I am curious about it, and I'm curious about sort of the negotiation of space between these three spheres. And I think it's really interesting how the biomedical model from this professional sphere has sort of bled into the individual sphere, but how that is also working with this folk sector, that, even in sort of the hegemony of the biomedical model, there is this sort of malaise that is sort of indicative of our time. And so, where does that come from, and how is that dealt with by the folk sector? And I think of particularly like chaplains or chaplaincy, for example, as being very rooted in that folk sector. And so like that people are sort of still reaching for these ambiguous forms of medical care that they do serve a function. Like if I go into a hospital with a broken arm, okay, maybe I don't want to, the first thing I want to talk about is what's the meaning of it? I want you to fix it. But perhaps digging a bit deeper, how did I incur the broken arm? Is there abuse? Is there self-harm? Like there's all these other issues that can be brought up when you do have those conversations. And so I think it's not one or the other. I think there, historically there was sort of in the medieval period that Dr. Musick was talking about, this very ambiguous sort of ritual rich society that then kind of swung the other way to this very rational, cognitive, biomedical. And I wonder if we are potentially heading into an age of integration of how do these both work together? And so you spoke a little bit about perhaps education of, training being a sort of a means to achieve that. And I think perhaps also like there are some structural, more funding or just that health benefits like publicly, or you have access to chiropractors and naturopath. And, so there are structural things that we can do. But I don't know if there's a question in there, but just what do you think of this?
No, I didn't want to open up the can of worms only for a few reasons. One of which I was like a little worried that like I was going to step on one group's toes, because in some ways folk kind of ends up with negative connotations, and I don't think it's intended like that in the model. But for what it's worth, sometimes feel like, oh man, we're not a folk tradition, we're like professionals, what? And so you're like, oh shoot, like I just insulted somebody by mistake.
Right.
But I would say that what I find interesting about the model, first off, is that professional and folk don't actually touch each other. And I would argue that like they probably should, because I think you've seen one thing I'd say is I think you've seen some attempts at professionalization from groups that might sort of been located in the folk realm at the outset of that model, is a way of gaining legitimacy that rightly probably should be given, or cultural prestige that probably should have been provided but wasn't being given for a variety of reasons, maybe because professionalism is seen as a way of prestige and they weren't professional, therefore no prestige. So I think that's one aspect that again I find interesting, and one of the reasons I didn't want to poke at it per se is I was like, I'm not really sure like how to like elaborate it in a useful way. So that was one thing. The other thing that I find really interesting is I find a lot of colleagues super frustrated that their patients went to see a naturopath, because they're like, I can't believe like they wasted their money, and like they said buy these vitamins and they bought the vitamins, and like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, well, there's a reason people are going, like, and there's utility there. And I think the utility that a lot of naturopaths, and I think with naturopathy in BC, you get some heterogeneity in terms of training. You have people, I think, that may call themselves naturopaths without much training. You have other people that have done a 4-year ND and training afterwards, for example. So there is some heterogeneity there, I will say, in terms of what I think of for training. But real utility a lot of times, because from what I understand, having not gone to a lot of naturopaths myself, but I'd say a lot of naturopaths are exceptionally good at listening and attending to people that are looking to be heard. Because I think a lot of, you go see a stranger sometimes of a tradition because you're looking to be heard for some reason, or you're looking for interpretation of something you may not understand. And I think that sense of the gift of time is really important. And I think gift is probably a nice way to think about it, because gifts structure relationships, right? So, if we thought about time as a gift and presence as a gift, and, it's sort of, I wouldn't call myself a Heideggerian. I've sort of, written a little bit with being in time and the idea of being there in Dasein, but like, the sense of sort of being there, like actually being in the world with this person that's sort of been thrown into a world of anxiety and sort of walking that space. I think that actually matters quite a bit, because illness is a lonely place. And so I think, there's tremendous utility in that, if nothing else, the ability for people to talk and be heard, and sometimes be able to sort of hear in their own talking by talking to someone else. I hadn't thought about it that way. Now the words are sort of out in the air, so to speak. I can kind of see that I hadn't before. So that would be one thing. I think that yeah, I think the idea, I keep coming back to biomedicine again as an interpretive, or I'd say professional medicine, because that's my people, right? Like, is actually need to thinking about it as an interpretive practice that needs to be channeled at specific levels. Obviously, more often than not, it does need to be channeled at the level of the body. If you've got a broken arm, we need to fix your arm. You need your arm to work. But yeah, the ability, and often in emergency rooms, they don't have time to sort of say, how'd you break that? It's not uncommon in my world where kids might present 3 times before they get picked up for non-accidental trauma, because people are like, oh, okay, yeah, I buy that story, that's fine, get out of here because I got to go see 5 other people. Then when it comes back like the 3rd time, like, oh, maybe we should get peds to see them because like this is a little whatever. But there's different sort of channels, I think, that we can educate people to dial into. Obviously the construction of the body through biology and pathophysiology is useful, but the construction of the illness experience, be that on sort of a more social level, what it sort of means in the frame of this person's life, for example, those may be activities that are better the realm of outpatient settings, where there may be less acute aspects to channel into, but there's no reason those channels can't be and shouldn't be developed. And again, I think when it comes to that professional sort of folk thing, what I think is sort of interesting to me is professional to me is almost like a professional sphere is almost like a special instance of the folk sphere in and of itself. It's like, I hesitate to use the term indigenous because they don't want to be used incorrectly, but in some ways the professional is sort of like, physicians are sort of indigenous to the professional tradition in that sense. So they are folk healers in their own right. They just happen to be professionalized for the sake of the model. So they're just sort of, maybe it's better that they're a smaller circle within a bigger tradition of healers, rather than their own separate sphere. But I think their symbolic power is such, the organization of some of these societies, that's probably why they ended up with their own bubble. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think professional is, even now that we're talking about it and I'm sort of hearing the word over and over, I think it is, it's a difficult word to use or to label that sphere, because it has taken on such a value statement, and like the professionalization of care is becoming so extreme that everyone wants to be a professional, whoever is providing care. And so I think there is, and for that, to put a chiropractor in the folk sector could be insulting for sure. But just, I guess that and that kind of maybe goes back to what Dr. Ruprecht was talking about, was this plurality, that we need a variety of modalities to deal with this really difficult experience of being human, and the illnesses that come from it. And so when does one go from being healthy to ill? And there's a lot of gray in there. And so yes, acute is sort of one extreme that can be addressed, but there's a whole lot else at play. And so maybe we need more spheres or something like that. I don't know, or just, that there's lots going on. So anyways, thank you so much.
Oh, totally. Right on. I totally agree. It is a spectrum, and one that needs to be, I think, far better problematized, honestly, not to turn everything into scholarly stuff, but it really does. I think actually to Tina's point that, like identity in physicians sort of almost happens just ad hoc sometimes. I don't want to read too much of what you're saying here, but I think it kind of is that way sometimes. I think, sometimes people get better despite us, you know what I mean? Like, and oh gosh, yeah, it's a whole other conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And I feel like there are so many threads that I wish we could keep pursuing, because I wanted to talk more about salvation too. And I feel like there's also the whole issue linked to professionalization of expertise, and how the idea of expertise connects to the symbolic power that that biomedical discourse has, and how we could compare that to the expertise that priests maybe had in the Catholic Church. So there's so many more directions that I wish we could take, and that means that hopefully there will be further discussions and conversations that unfold. But we do have to close for today. So if we could give a really warm round of applause and thanks to Dr. Shrew. Thank you so much for being here with us, especially in the midst of biblical flooding. It's impressive that you managed to put together a talk.
We're building an ark this weekend, don't worry. So.
Pandemics and floods. So thank you so much. And I wish everyone a really lovely weekend. I wish a dry weekend to those of you in BC.
Right on.